A Chiricahua Apache warrior stood over a dying white woman and her newborn child in the merciless heat of the Gila wilderness and offered her a bargain that would shatter every rule of his world, become his wife, and he would raise the bastard infant as his own son. This was not romance born under desert stars. This was survival stripped to its rawest form, a transaction proposed by a man who understood that mercy, in that God-forsaken territory, was the most dangerous currency of all. His name was Ishkai, and for 32 years, his existence had been measured in gunpowder and solitude. The trails of the borderlands knew him well, those treacherous paths where Apache blood mixed with Mexican dust, where wagon trains crept like desperate insects across an expanse that wanted them dead. He was a scout, a warrior hardened by 2 decades of conflict that had carved lines into his copper skin and left his heart as barren as the canyons he called home. The silver coins heavy in his saddlebag meant nothing against the howling emptiness that greeted him each night, when the campfire died and sleep refused to come. The sun hung brutal and absolute when he found her. A crumpled shape beside a sun-blasted mesquite, the kind of tree that survived by stubbornness alone in that merciless country. Her dress was torn, her lips cracked and bleeding. Her arms wrapped around a bundle that mewled weakly against her chest. Ruth Selby, though he did not yet know her name, had been cast out like refuse from her settlement. A young woman of perhaps 23 whose only crime was bearing a child without the blessing of a preacher's words and a gold ring. The good Christian people of her community had expelled her to die with dignity, they claimed, as if there was dignity in leaving a mother and infant to the buzzards. Every instinct Ishkai possessed screamed warnings. White women meant trouble, complications that could ignite wars, misunderstandings that ended in massacres. Yet something deeper than reason moved through him as he dismounted, his moccasins silent on the scorched earth. Perhaps it was the way her fingers still clutched the baby despite her own body's surrender to dehydration. Perhaps it was the fierce animal determination he recognized in her half-closed eyes when she sensed his shadow falling across her face. She did not beg. She did not weep. She simply looked at him with the resignation of someone who had already measured her own grave. His words, when they came, were blunt instruments offered without poetry or pretense. The arrangement he proposed was transactional, spoken in the rough border Spanish they both understood. He would provide for them, protect them, claim them as his own. In return, she would become his wife in name, would come to his people's stronghold, would accept the life of an Apache woman. There would be no love, no gentle courtship, no promises beyond the fundamental exchange. Her submission to this foreign existence in exchange for breath in her lungs and milk for the child. Ruth's acceptance came not in words, but in the way her cracked fingers reached for the water skin he offered, the way she allowed him to lift her and the baby onto his horse, the way she did not look back at the direction from which she had been exiled. She had nothing left to lose, no world to return to, no future except the one this scarred warrior was offering. And so, beneath that pitiless sun, 2 outcasts bound themselves together, not in passion, but in the cold arithmetic of survival. The Copper Canyon stronghold rose from the earth like a fortress of stone and defiance, a place where the Apache had carved existence from rock and rage for generations beyond counting. Ishkai brought his new bride into that sacred space 3 days after finding her on the trail, and the reception was as cold as the desert night. Eyes followed Ruth Selby through the encampment with the weight of judgment and suspicion. She was Ndeschi, White Eyes, the enemy who had stolen their lands, murdered their children, broken every treaty with lies dripping from forked tongues. That she came bearing a pale infant only deepened the insult. Whispers moved through the stronghold like smoke, questioning Ishkai's sanity, his loyalty, his honor as a warrior. The hostility was a living thing, palpable and sharp. Women turned their backs when Ruth approached the communal fire. Men spat into the dust when she passed. Children mimicking their elders threw small stones that fell short but carried the full weight of rejection. Ishkai provided her with a dwelling at the edge of the encampment, a practical location that spoke volumes about her status, close enough to be under his protection, far enough to keep her contamination from spreading. He gave her basic necessities: blankets woven from yucca fiber, clay vessels for water, dried meat, and ground mesquite beans. Then he left her to prove herself because in Apache society, worth was not declared but demonstrated through action and endurance. Ruth understood the terms of her survival with the clarity of someone who had already died once. She rose before dawn, when the world was still purple and cold, and she worked. Her hands, soft from a life of settlement domesticity, grew calloused and raw. She learned to grind corn using the metate stone, a task that left her shoulders screaming and her palms bleeding. She learned to identify edible plants among the hostile vegetation, guided by brief, grudging gestures from women who would not speak to her directly. She learned to carry water from the distant spring, balancing heavy clay vessels on her hip in the way of Apache women, stumbling at first, then finding the rhythm that made the burden bearable. The infant Elijah complicated everything. His cries echoed through the canyon at night, a sound that reminded everyone of his white blood, his illegitimate existence. Ruth fed him from her own depleted body, watched him struggle against the harsh climate, felt terror crystallize in her chest every time his skin grew too hot or his breathing turned shallow. She had no medicines from her old world, no doctor to summon, no church ladies to bring soup and sympathy. She had only her fierce animal determination to keep this child breathing, and that determination caught the attention of Galishtin. The old woman was the stronghold's healer, keeper of knowledge passed down through generations, reader of plants and bodies and spirits. Galishtin had lived 70 winters, survived 3 wars, buried 2 husbands and 5 children. Her face was a geography of survival, and her eyes missed nothing. She appeared at Ruth's dwelling one morning without announcement, examining the pale infant with hands that moved with clinical precision. Ruth watched in silence, understanding that this was a test more crucial than any other. Galishtin spoke no English and Ruth spoke no Apache, but their communication transcended words. The old healer demonstrated how to brew teas from desert willow bark to reduce fever, how to create poultices from prickly pear pulp to soothe rashes, how to recognize the subtle signs of dehydration before they became fatal. Ruth absorbed every lesson with desperate focus, her hands mimicking Galishtin's movements, her memory cataloging each plant and preparation method. When Elijah's fever broke after 3 days of careful treatment, Galishtin gave Ruth the smallest nod of acknowledgement, not friendship, not acceptance, but recognition that this white woman possessed the fundamental quality required for survival in Apache country, the ability to learn and adapt without complaint. As weeks became months, Ruth's transformation was visible in more than her sun-darkened skin and work-hardened hands. She began to understand the rhythm of the stronghold, the unspoken hierarchies and responsibilities that governed communal life. She learned to move with economy and purpose, wasting no motion, no resource. She contributed what she could, helping with harvests, tending cooking fires, offering her needle and thread for repairs. The contempt directed at her gradually shifted from active hostility to grudging tolerance. She would never be truly Apache, never be fully welcomed, but she had earned the right to occupy this marginal space, to exist on the periphery of their world. Ishke observed her progress from a careful distance. He provided for her and Elijah as promised, bringing meat from his hunts, ensuring her dwelling remained secure. But he did not visit often, did not share her sleeping space, did not seek the intimacies that might have been expected between husband and wife. Their marriage remained what it had always been, a contract, a practical arrangement designed to solve problems of survival rather than loneliness. Yet something in him shifted as he watched her endure the stronghold's rejection without breaking, watched her fight for Elijah's life with a ferocity that rivaled any warrior's courage. The transaction he had proposed on that sun-blasted trail was beginning to reveal unexpected depths, foundations more solid than simple convenience. The turning point arrived with the scream of a child and the paralysis of an entire community facing the limits of their knowledge. It was late summer, when the heat pressed down like a physical weight, and even the strongest warriors moved slowly through the afternoon hours. A boy of perhaps 6 winters, son of one of the clan's respected hunters, had been bitten by a diamondback rattlesnake while playing near the canyon's edge. The serpent's fangs had struck deep into his calf, and within minutes the flesh had begun to swell grotesquely, turning purple and black as the venom spread through his small body. Galishtin worked with urgent precision, cutting the wound, attempting to draw out the poison, applying every remedy in her vast knowledge. But the venom was powerful, and the child was small. His breathing grew labored, his eyes rolled back, and his mother's wails echoed off the canyon walls as the community gathered in helpless witness to what seemed an inevitable tragedy. The Apache understood death intimately, accepted it as part of existence's harsh bargain, but the death of a child still tore at the fabric of their collective soul. Ruth had been grinding corn at her dwelling when she heard the commotion. She arrived at the scene to find Galishtin's face set in grim lines, the old healer's hands still working, but her eyes carrying the shadow of defeat. Ruth's settlement upbringing, the very world that had rejected her, had included years of assisting her own mother with healing work. She had seen snake bites before, new treatments that combined frontier medicine with desperate innovation. Her mind raced through options, knowing that any action she took could either save this child or cement her permanent outsider status if she failed. She moved forward without asking permission, understanding that hesitation would be interpreted as weakness or doubt. Her hands went to the child's leg, examining the bite, measuring the spread of discoloration, feeling for the thready pulse that indicated how close he was to complete system failure. She turned to Galishtin and spoke in broken Apache supplemented with gestures, requesting specific plants: white sage for its anti-inflammatory properties, crushed tobacco leaves to draw out toxins, strips of leather for a tourniquet that would slow but not stop circulation. The old healer's eyes narrowed in assessment. Then she barked orders to nearby women who scattered to gather the requested materials. What followed was a delicate operation performed under the scrutiny of the entire stronghold. Ruth applied the tourniquet with careful precision, tight enough to slow the venom's spread, but loose enough to prevent tissue death. She created a poultice combining multiple plant elements, each chosen for specific properties, and packed it thick around the wound. She elevated the leg, monitored the child's breathing, adjusted her treatments based on subtle changes in his condition. Hours passed with agonizing slowness, the sun tracking across the sky while the community maintained their vigil. The child did not die. As darkness fell and the desert air finally cooled, his breathing stabilized. The grotesque swelling began to recede. His eyes opened with something approaching clarity rather than the glaze of approaching death. His mother wept differently now, tears of relief rather than grief, and she reached for Ruth's hand with a grip that conveyed more than any words. Galishtin examined Ruth's work with professional thoroughness, then spoke words in Apache that Ruth did not fully understand, but whose meaning was clear in tone and context: acknowledgement, respect, perhaps even the beginning of approval. Yet the true revelation came later that night, after the child had been moved to his family's dwelling and Ruth had returned to her own space. Exhausted and shaking with delayed reaction, Ishkai appeared at her threshold, his presence filling the doorway. He had been away on a scouting mission during the crisis, had returned to find the entire stronghold speaking of the white woman who had saved a warrior's son where even Galishtin's knowledge had proven insufficient. He looked at Ruth for a long moment, seeing her perhaps truly for the first time, not as a burden he had accepted, not as a problem he had solved, but as a woman of competence and courage who had earned her place through action rather than bloodline. He entered her dwelling and sat across the fire from her. They did not speak much. Their shared languages were still limited and awkward. But he stayed through the night for the first time since bringing her to the stronghold, his presence a statement to the community, and to Ruth herself. The marriage that had been purely transactional was shifting, foundations deepening into something neither had anticipated or perhaps even wanted, but which was happening nonetheless with the inevitability of water finding its path through stone. In saving the child, Ruth had also saved herself. She was no longer merely Ishkai's white burden, but a woman with proven value, someone the community needed even if they did not yet fully accept her. She had used the very knowledge her old world had given her to secure her place in this new one, turning her exile's education into survival's currency. And Ishke, watching her that night across the fire, felt something crack in the careful armor he had built around his warrior's heart. The first genuine stirring of connection to another human being in more years than he cared to count. The seasons turned, and with them came gradual transformation, the kind that happens so slowly, it becomes visible only when looking back across accumulated months. Ruth and Ishke's marriage evolved from its transactional origins into something more complex, built not on passion's sudden fire, but on the steady accumulation of shared labor, mutual respect, and the intimacy that comes from surviving hardship side by side. They became partners in the truest sense, two people learning to move through the world as a coordinated unit, rather than separate entities bound by convenience. Ishke began teaching Ruth the Apache way of reading the land, knowledge essential for survival in that harsh territory. He showed her how to find water by watching the flight patterns of birds and the growth direction of certain plants. He taught her to identify animal tracks, to measure their freshness by moisture and sharpness of edge, to understand what the desert's creatures were doing and where they were heading. He demonstrated how to move silently through rough terrain, how to make oneself invisible against the landscape through stillness and awareness. These lessons were practical necessities, but they were also acts of trust and inclusion, invitations into the knowledge that defined Apache existence. Ruth proved an apt student, bringing the same fierce determination to these lessons that she had brought to every challenge since arriving at the stronghold. Her ears learned to distinguish between the rustle of wind and the movement of prey. Her eyes learned to spot the subtle discolorations that indicated water-bearing rock or dangerous terrain. Her body learned the economy of movement that allowed survival in extreme conditions. Ishke watched her progress with something approaching pride, this emotion surprising him with its warmth. She was becoming capable in ways that transcended the basic survival skills he had expected, developing the deeper understanding that separated mere existence from true mastery of the desert's harsh demands. Their evenings together developed a rhythm of quiet companionship. Ruth would work on practical tasks, repairing clothing, preparing food, creating the countless small necessities of daily life, while Ishke tended to his weapons and equipment. They spoke more now, Ruth's Apache improving steadily while Ishke's English remained deliberately limited, but functional. Their conversations ranged across practical matters and gradually into more personal territory. Memories of their separate pasts, observations about the present, cautious speculation about the future. Ruth told him about her settlement life, the suffocating expectations and rigid judgments that had shaped her world before shame and exile. Ishke shared carefully selected stories from his warrior life, the battles and losses that had carved him into the man he had become. The child Elijah became a bridge between them, a shared responsibility that deepened their bond. Ishke began teaching the boy Apache ways despite his white blood, recognizing that the child's survival depended on his ability to navigate both worlds. He carried Elijah on horseback across the desert, teaching him to feel the animal's rhythm and trust the partnership between rider and mount. He showed him how to craft tools from stone and bone, fundamental skills that connected the boy to generations of Apache knowledge. Elijah absorbed these lessons with the natural adaptability of childhood, his identity forming not as exclusively white or Apache, but as something hybrid and unique. Ruth watched Ishke with her son and felt something shift in her own heart, a recognition that this warrior's care for a child, not his own blood, represented a kind of fatherhood more profound than biological accident. Ishke had chosen Elijah, had claimed him when the world would have let him die, and continued choosing him every day through patient teaching and fierce protection. This was not duty performed grudgingly, but genuine commitment, and it revealed dimensions of Ishke's character that his warrior facade typically concealed. The community's attitude toward Ruth evolved in parallel with her growing competence. Women who had once turned their backs began including her in work groups, acknowledging her contributions with brief nods and occasional words. Men who had spat at her passage now offered neutral greetings. Children stopped throwing stones and instead watched with curiosity as she went about her tasks. She would never be fully Apache. Her pale skin and foreign origins were permanent markers of difference. But she had earned a place within the community's complex social structure, a position defined by proven worth rather than birthright. Yet the most significant transformation was internal. Ruth felt herself becoming someone new, shaped by the desert's demands and the Apache way of being. The settlement woman she had been, concerned with propriety and appearance, measuring her worth by the community's approval, was dying like a shed skin. In her place emerged someone harder and more resilient, someone who measured herself by her own capabilities and the survival of those she loved. She found unexpected freedom in this transformation, liberation from the suffocating expectations that had defined her previous existence. One night, as they sat together outside their dwelling watching stars scatter across the vast darkness, Ishke reached across the small distance between them and took Ruth's hand. It was a simple gesture, almost tentative, but it carried the weight of profound meaning. This was not the transactional touch of duty, but the connection of genuine affection, the acknowledgement that somewhere in their shared struggle they had become not just partners, but companions. Ruth's fingers intertwined with his, and they sat in silence as the desert night deepened around them, two people who had found unexpected belonging in each other's presence. The fragile peace they had constructed was shattered by the appearance of a man from Ruth's past, riding into the territory with the swagger of someone who believed himself entitled to anything he desired. Jonas Thorne arrived at the stronghold in early autumn, accompanied by two hired guns whose presence announced his intentions more clearly than any words. He was Elijah's biological father, though that designation meant nothing in terms of actual parenthood. He had abandoned Ruth when her pregnancy became visible, had denied any responsibility, had contributed to her exile from the settlement. Now he returned with demands and documents, seeking to claim the child he had once rejected. Word of Elijah's survival and his placement within an Apache stronghold had reached the settlements through the tangled network of traders, scouts, and gossip that connected the borderland's disparate communities. Jonas had heard not just that the child lived, but that Ruth had married a Chiricahua warrior of growing reputation, a man who controlled resources and silver earned through scouting work. Jonas saw opportunity where others might see justice denied. He calculated that the embarrassment of having his bastard son raised by Apaches would give him leverage, that Ishke might pay handsomely to preserve his wife's honor and avoid complications. Ishke met Jonas in the open ground before the stronghold, with the entire community gathering to witness this confrontation. The contrast between the two men was stark and telling. Jonas was soft despite his posturing, his body showing the comfortable excess of someone who had never truly known hardship. His clothes were clean, his hands uncalloused, his face bearing the smug confidence of a man who believed the law and social convention were shields sufficient to protect him. Ishke stood opposite him like carved stone, every line of his body radiating the controlled danger of a predator assessing prey. He wore his warrior status not in decoration but in presence, the absolute certainty of someone who had survived by being faster, smarter, and more ruthless than those who had tried to kill him. Jonas laid out his demands with theatrical righteousness, claiming his legal right as biological father to custody of the child. He spoke of blood ties and Christian duty, of the impropriety of a white child being raised among savages, of his willingness to forgive Ruth's indiscretions if she would return to civilization and bring the boy. His voice carried the false sincerity of a con artist working a mark, and his eyes kept darting to Ishke's dwelling, calculating its contents, measuring potential profit. He mentioned compensation as if it were an afterthought, a reasonable request for his trouble in traveling so far. But the greed underlying every word was transparent to anyone paying attention. Ishke let him speak without interruption, his own silence more powerful than any immediate rebuttal. He watched Jonas the way a hawk watches a rabbit, with patient focus and absolute clarity about the encounter's inevitable conclusion. When Jonas finally stopped talking, When his rehearsed speech had exhausted itself and the silence stretched uncomfortable and long, Ishkai spoke in English rough but perfectly clear. His words cut through Jonas's pretensions with surgical precision, laying bare the truth that everyone present already understood. A father, Ishkai explained, was not determined by a momentary act of lust or the accident of seed taking root. A father was the man who protected, who provided, who taught, who stayed through sickness and hardship and danger. A father was measured by presence and action, not by documents or blood. Jonas Thorne had abandoned Ruth when she needed him most, had left her to die in the desert with their child, had contributed nothing to Elijah's survival or growth. By Apache law and by any moral standard worth honoring, Jonas had forfeited every claim the moment he turned his back. Ishkai had claimed the boy, had given him a home and a future, had chosen to be father when the biological parent had chosen to be nothing. The confrontation could have ended in violence. Jonas's hired guns fingered their weapons nervously, sensing the situation's volatility. But Ruth's appearance shifted the dynamic entirely. She emerged from the dwelling carrying Elijah, now a healthy child of nearly 2 years, and she positioned herself beside Ishkai with deliberate choice. Her voice, when she spoke, carried none of the shame Jonas had expected to exploit. She denounced him publicly and thoroughly, recounting his cowardice and abandonment, his lies and manipulation. She declared before all witnesses that Ishkai was Elijah's true father in every way that mattered, that she would die before allowing Jonas to claim the child he had once condemned to death. The assembled Apache understood every word, even if their English was limited, the emotional truth transcending language barriers. They saw in Ruth's stance and Ishkai's presence a family forged by choice and commitment, and they saw in Jonas the kind of weakness and dishonor that their culture despised. Godah, a kinsman who had long harbored resentment toward Ishkai, stepped forward with an unexpected offer. He would serve as witness to a document renouncing Jonas's parental rights, making it binding under white man's law. This gesture was not kindness toward Ruth or Ishkai, but rather Godah's own hatred of white weakness personified by Jonas. The enemy of his enemy merited momentary alliance. Jonas, faced with unified opposition and recognizing that violence would mean his death, accepted the terms. A document was prepared and signed, his mark upon it witnessed by multiple parties, legally severing his claim to Elijah. He left the territory with his hired guns and empty hands. His scheme collapsed, his cowardice exposed. Ishkai had won not through violence, but through the demonstration of authentic fatherhood, and the community's respect for him deepened in recognition of his principled stand. Yet this public victory carried private costs. The confrontation had drawn attention to the unconventional nature of Ishkai's family, had reminded the community of the white blood flowing through his household. Godah's assistance in the moment masked deeper resentments that would soon emerge. The document resolving Elijah's custody was safely secured, but the questions it raised about tradition and adaptation were merely postponed, not answered. The tension that had been building beneath the surface erupted at the annual tribal council, a gathering where the Chiricahua clans came together to discuss matters of survival, strategy, and tradition. The council was held in the depth of winter, when the desert cold bit through even the thickest blankets, and the community pressed close around massive fires that barely held the darkness at bay. Leaders from multiple family groups attended, warriors and elders whose collective wisdom guided Apache response to the pressures crushing them from all sides. The agenda was heavy with urgent matters: Mexican military movements, American settlement encroachments, diminishing hunting grounds, and the persistent question of how to preserve their way of life in the face of overwhelming external force. Godah chose this moment to launch his attack, and it was far more dangerous than Jonas Thorne's transparent greed had ever been. Godah was no outsider or coward. He was bloodkin to Ishkai, a cousin descended from the same ancestral line, a warrior with his own battle honors and status within the community. His resentment had been festering for years, fed by jealousy of Ishkai's reputation and a genuine ideological fury at what he perceived as contamination of Apache purity. Godia represented the faction within the community that believed survival meant absolute rejection of the white world and everything connected to it. He rose before the assembled council and spoke with the kind of passionate conviction that transforms personal grievance into political rhetoric. His words were carefully chosen to wound where Ishkai was most vulnerable. He questioned whether a warrior who had married a white woman and adopted her bastard child could truly represent Apache interests. He argued that Ishkai's household represented dangerous compromise, a softening that would lead to destruction. He pointed to history, the countless betrayals, the broken treaties, the diseases and violence that followed every Apache attempt to coexist with whites. And he framed Ishkai's choices as the first steps toward cultural suicide. The accusation that cut deepest was his suggestion that Ishkai's loyalties had become divided, that he could no longer be trusted to make decisions purely for the benefit of his people. Godaa spoke of Mexican wives as one thing. The Apache and Mexicans had been at war and peace and war again for generations. Their blood had mixed before. Their conflicts were ancient but comprehensible. But a white woman, he argued, was different. The Americans represented total annihilation, the complete erasure of the Apache way of life. By bringing one into their stronghold, by raising her child as Apache, Ishkai was betraying the sacrifices of all who had died defending their lands and freedom. The council chamber fell silent when Godaa finished, the kind of quiet that precedes either violence or decision. Eyes turned to Ishkai, measuring his response, judging whether Godaa's accusations carried truth. This was the moment that would define Ishkai's place within his community, that would determine whether the family he had built could survive or would be torn apart by ideological purity. Ishkai stood slowly, and his response began not with anger, but with acknowledgement. He honored the ancestors Godaa had invoked, recounted their sacrifices and courage, validated the fear underlying his kinsman's fury. He did not pretend that the white invasion was anything less than catastrophic, did not minimize the suffering his people had endured. But then he shifted the ground of the argument, forcing the council to confront uncomfortable truths they preferred to avoid. Survival, Ishkai declared, meant more than blind adherence to tradition. It meant adaptation without surrender. It meant making choices that honored the spirit of their ancestors' resistance, even when the forms had to change. He had not married Ruth out of weakness or lust, but out of recognition that their world was already changed. That purity was a luxury their situation no longer afforded. His son Elijah would grow up speaking Apache and English, understanding both worlds, capable of navigating the dangerous territories between cultures. This was not betrayal, but preparation, equipping the next generation with tools for survival in a landscape their ancestors could never have imagined. He spoke of loyalty not as abstract ideology but as concrete action. He had protected Apache interests as a scout, had brought silver and resources to the stronghold, had never compromised his people's security or safety. His household's unusual composition had not weakened him, but had strengthened his understanding of the enemies they faced, had given him insights into white thinking that made him more effective, not less. And he pointed to Ruth's own actions, her healing knowledge that had saved Apache children, her hard work that contributed to the community's welfare, her acceptance of their ways despite the hostility she faced. The argument might have remained philosophical, a debate among men about principles and strategy, but Ruth herself shattered that possibility. She appeared at the council entrance carrying their second son, Nalnish, born months earlier. Apache women did not traditionally attend council discussions, but Ruth was beyond caring about protocol. She had heard enough of the debate, understood enough of the implications. She stepped into that circle of warriors and elders with her infant son in her arms, and she spoke in halting but clear Apache, addressing them with the same fierce courage she had shown in every trial since arriving at the stronghold. She told them she was proud to be Ishkai's wife, proud to raise her children in Apache ways, proud of the home they had built together. She acknowledged her white blood but declared it did not define her loyalty or her commitment. Her son Nalnish was Apache by birth and by choice, and she would raise him and Elijah to honor the traditions they were being taught. She would not apologize for surviving, or for the mercy Ishkai had shown her. She would stand beside her husband against any who threatened the family they had forged. Godah's response was vicious and personal, insults that crossed the line from ideological debate into direct attack. He called her a whore, called her children pollution, suggested that Ishkai's protection of them revealed weakness that would endanger the entire stronghold. The words were chosen to provoke, to force either submission or explosion, and they succeeded. Ishkai moved with the speed that had kept him alive through 2 decades of warfare. He crossed the space between himself and Godah in 3 long strides, and the blow he delivered was not restrained by council decorum or kinship ties. His fist connected with Godah's jaw with force that lifted the man off his feet and sent him sprawling into the dirt. Ishkai followed, pinning him down, hand at his throat, eyes promising death if Godah spoke one more word of insult toward Ruth or their children. The watching warriors made no move to intervene. This was between kinsmen, a settling of accounts that had been building for years. Godah had pushed beyond acceptable bounds, had attacked not just policy but family, and Apache culture recognized the legitimacy of physical response to such violations. When Ishkai finally released him, Godah remained on the ground, his face bloodied, his own humiliation complete. The message was clear. Anyone who threatened Ishkai's family would meet the full fury of a warrior who had nothing left to lose and everything to protect. The council did not vote or issue formal judgment. Their silence was decision enough. Ishkai's choices were his own, his family was recognized as legitimate, and any further challenges would be dealt with as personal grievances rather than communal concerns. The victory was real but incomplete, marking the family's survival but not their full acceptance. They remained different, unusual, a subject of ongoing debate and discomfort, but they had won the right to exist, to continue building the life they had chosen, and that was victory enough for the moment. 5 years passed, and with them came the deepening of roots that no ideology or resentment could easily tear loose. The family grew as families do, expanding to include a daughter named Kimi, whose arrival brought new joy and complexity to the household. Elijah, now 7, moved through the stronghold with the confidence of a child who belonged in multiple worlds. He spoke Apache fluently, his accent perfect, his understanding of customs and expectations thorough. He also retained his English and learned Spanish from the Mexican families who traded with the stronghold, his mind absorbing languages with the ease of youth. He became a bridge, whether anyone intended it or not, a living demonstration that identity could be more than singular. Ruth's transformation was complete, in ways that would have seemed impossible during those first desperate days. She had become Galishtin's assistant and eventual successor, the old healer training her methodically in plant knowledge, ritual practices, and the deep understanding of body and spirit that defined Apache healing traditions. Ruth brought her own frontier medicine knowledge to this apprenticeship, creating a hybrid practice that proved remarkably effective. Women sought her help with difficult births. Families brought their sick children to her dwelling. Warriors consulted her about injuries and persistent pains. She had earned not just acceptance, but respect, a position within the community that transcended her origin story. Ishkai himself had risen in status, his reputation as scout and warrior growing with each successful mission. His ability to understand both Apache and white perspectives made him invaluable for negotiating the increasingly complex political landscape. The silver he brought back from his work provided security for multiple families, and his counsel at council meetings carried weight earned through consistent good judgment. He and Ruth had built something rare and precious, a partnership of equals, a marriage that began in transaction but had evolved into genuine love. Yet the past was never truly past, and forgiveness remained unfinished business that arrived one autumn morning in the form of an old man on a tired horse. Abram Selby, Ruth's father, appeared at the canyon's edge like a ghost, his body bent with age and illness, his face carrying the deep marks of guilt and grief. He had spent years wrestling with what he had done to his daughter, the shame that had driven him to expel her, the cowardice that had let him believe propriety mattered more than blood. His wife had died. His farm had failed, and he had nothing left but the crushing weight of regret. Word reached Ruth long before he arrived at the stronghold proper, carried by scouts who monitored all approaches. She had time to prepare, to feel the complex emotions his presence evoked: rage at his betrayal, sorrow at their severed relationship, and underneath it all, a deep ache for the father she had once loved. When he finally stood before her dwelling, she did not immediately welcome him or turn him away. She simply looked at him, this broken old man who represented the world that had tried to destroy her. Ishke watched this reunion from a distance, understanding that this decision belonged to Ruth alone. He saw in Abram's ravaged face a kindred brokenness, recognized the particular agony of a parent who had failed their child. Apache tradition valued family bonds intensely, but also acknowledged that some violations were beyond forgiveness. Whether Ruth extended mercy to the man who had shown her none was her choice to make, and Ishkai would support whatever she decided. The reconciliation that eventually developed was cautious and incomplete, built on actions rather than words. Ruth allowed her father to stay on the stronghold's periphery, gave him basic necessities but no immediate warmth. Abram did not ask for forgiveness, seemed to understand he had forfeited that right. Instead, he simply existed in proximity to the family he had rejected, watching his grandchildren grow, helping with small tasks when his health permitted, accepting the limited relationship Ruth was willing to grant. Over months, something shifted. Elijah, with a child's straightforward affection, adopted his grandfather without complication, climbing into Abram's lap to hear stories, teaching him Apache words with patient repetition. Nalnish and Kimi followed their brother's lead, accepting this old man as family because that was what they were told he was. Abram's presence with the children gradually thawed Ruth's frozen anger. She began to see that his suffering was real, that his isolation mirrored what she had once endured, and that continuing to punish him changed nothing about the past while poisoning the present. The full healing came one evening when Abram suffered a severe illness, his body failing in the way of men who have lived too long with grief. Ruth tended him with her healer's skill, sat beside him through the night, and in the vulnerable hours before dawn, they finally spoke the truths that needed saying. Abram confessed his shame and cowardice, acknowledged that losing Ruth had been his gravest failure. Ruth told him about her suffering, the terror and abandonment she had felt, but also about the unexpected blessing that had come from her exile. She would not be who she was, would not have the family and life she cherished if he had not expelled her. His betrayal had led to her transformation, and while she could not say she was grateful for his cruelty, she could acknowledge that it had delivered her to a life more authentic than the one she would have lived in the settlement. Abram survived the illness, recovered enough to live several more years. He became a fixture at the stronghold, an old white man who belonged nowhere and everywhere, accepted because Ruth and Ishkai's children loved him without reservation. His presence represented the possibility of redemption, even for those who had committed unforgivable acts, the complex truth that people could change and relationships could heal even when the scars never fully disappeared. The years continued their inevitable passage, bringing with them the small and large moments that constitute a life. Elijah grew into a young man who worked as translator and mediator, his unique position between cultures giving him a role no one had anticipated needing. Nalnish showed promise as a warrior, his Apache blood carrying him naturally into the training and traditions of his people. Kimi absorbed healing knowledge from her mother, already demonstrating the focused intelligence that would make her Galishtin's true successor. The family that had begun as an impossible bargain between a desperate woman and a lonely warrior had become a thriving, complex unit that contributed to the community in multiple ways. Ishke and Ruth grew old together, their bodies marked by the desert's harshness and the years' passage, but their partnership only deepening with time. They sat together on countless evenings watching the sun paint the canyon walls in shades of copper and gold, comfortable in silence or engaged in conversation, simply present with each other in ways that spoke of profound intimacy and trust. They had survived challenges that should have destroyed them, had built something lasting from the rawest materials of desperation and mercy. The story of how they came together became one told around fires throughout the Apache territories, a narrative that carried meanings beyond the simple facts. It spoke to the possibility of choosing family rather than being limited by blood, to the strength found in adaptation rather than rigid tradition, to the unexpected consequences of mercy in a merciless world. Young people heard it and wondered about the boundaries they had assumed were fixed. Elders debated its lessons, acknowledging both its beauty and its complications. On a particular evening in their later years, Ruth and Ishkai sat together as they had countless times before, watching their grandchildren play in the canyon's golden light. Elijah's own family was growing, children who carried forward the hybrid heritage that had once seemed impossible. The stronghold had changed, as all things must, adapting to a world that offered fewer and fewer choices about how to survive. But this family remained, a testament to decisions made in extremity, to the courage required to build across chasms that others insisted were unbridgeable. Ishkai took Ruth's weathered hand in his own, and their fingers intertwined with the natural ease of decades' practice. No words passed between them in that moment. None were needed. They had said everything that mattered through the life they had built together, through the children they had raised, through the countless small acts of partnership and loyalty that had accumulated into something approaching grace. The desert wind moved through the canyon carrying the voices of their descendants, and it carried too the deeper truth their story embodied, that strength is measured not in weapons or blood purity, but in the unwavering, fierce love for the family one chooses to build, decision by decision, against all odds. They had crossed impossible distances to find each other, two outcasts who became the foundation of a legacy that would endure long after the desert reclaimed their bones. And in the gathering dusk of that particular evening, surrounded by evidence of their shared victory over circumstance and expectation, they rested in the profound peace of those who have fought well and won what matters most. If you found yourself moved by this journey across the harsh and beautiful borderlands, by the story of two people who refused to accept the limitations their worlds tried to impose, leave a comment sharing where you are watching from and what resonated most deeply with you. Subscribe to continue exploring these tales of courage, survival, and the families we forge in defiance of every obstacle. These stories matter because they remind us that our choices define us more than our origins ever could.